Grazie a tutti. Stamattina parlerò in inglese. So I would like to start by thanking Pietro Constantini and the members of the scientific committee for allowing me to participate and to do so remotely. So to begin, la prossima slide. Grazie. By the end of the 16th century, members of the Franciscan Order had begun drawing upon the long-standing European tradition of ossuaries, also known as charnel houses, to develop a new manner of mortuary decoration comprised of post-mortem materials. Ossuaries survive all over Europe, but many of the Franciscan burial chambers defied categorization as simple repositories by including elaborate installations in which the dead were granted a fantastical mimicry of afterlife imagined by the living. La próxima. Among these curated environments, the earliest and most intricate were created by the Capuchins, which are distinctive in their utilization of mummified cadavers as well as dismembered skeletons. Now, unfortunately, these monuments have been largely ignored by Anglo-American scholars, and when they do receive attention, they are often described as exempla of a perverse and superstitious Baroque necroculture. Such interpretations have obscured the role of these monuments within the Capuchin Order's larger recuperative project of early Franciscan spiritual culture. Indeed, the Capuchin movement began in Italy in 1528 with the purpose of recovering a more spiritually authentic past, one modeled on the pious simplicity of the first Franciscans. I believe the bone installations originally were expressions of the order's retrospective spiritual mission and born of its demands for rigorous self-discipline. So it is from the perspective of early Capuchin aestheticism that I will attempt to identify how these exhibitions of death supported the order's ideals in post-Tridentine Italy, specifically in Palermo and in Roma. La próxima slide. Human bones stand for a lost presence, much like paintings or sculptures called to mind an absent person. But unlike other artistic media, the substitutional potential of bones moves beyond representation to material equivalence. The bones are who they represent, but they are more than that as well. Each bone is also a unique identity that will rise again at the second coming of Christ. Thus, for the frati who first created and interacted with these crypt installations, human bones were not understood as inert or impotent materials. The promise of the resurrection had granted them a latent vitality. They are a potentially reanimate medium. La próxima. The transformation of human bones into art, therefore, can reveal a great deal about how early Capuchin communities understood the relationship between personal identity and the material continuity of the body. In each case that we will examine, the emotional presence and symbolic meanings of the bone installations were dependent on the local context. But as we shall see, these artistic manipulations of the dead reveal a persistent tension. It's a tension between, on the one hand, the friars' dedication to self-abnegation, that is, their commitment to self-denial and the renunciation of worldly things, and on the other hand, to a desire to prolong the bonds of affection between brothers. Now, to better understand this tension, we must consider the spiritual imperatives of early Capuchin aestheticism. La próxima. In his account of the lives of the first Capuchins, the chronicler Far Bernardino Cioli da Calpitrazzo distinguished the texts from which the friars were to extract the manner of life and desire of St. Francis. As you can see from this quote here, these included the Conformities, the Chronicles of the Order, the Legenda of San Bonaventura, and the writings of brothers Leone, Angelo, and Rufino, among others. Now, by practicing the aesthetical behaviors recorded in these texts, the friars would learn to desire as St. Francis desired, to perceive, to sense, and respond to experience as St. Francis did. Now, essential to this training was the imitation of St. Francis's relationship with Christ, which established absolute trust in Jesus through suffering. Now, such imitation was intended to enact a transformation of desire, away from self-love and towards altruistic, benevolent love, and the empathetic perception of pain and abhorrent sensations. La próxima? The próxima slide? Yeah, perfect. St. Francis offered an example of this transformation in his testament when describing his experience with lepers, leprosi. And I will repeat the Latin in English here. Quote, "And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body." End quote. Now, that sentiment of contentment by undergoing hardship is echoed repeatedly in Capuchin mystical literature. La próxima? Next. Perfect. Such as Tommaso acerbe sta olere scala di perfezione. And this is where Tommaso writes, and again I'll quote in English, "One who is attracted by pure love of God will become so crazy that he will fear neither the world, nor hell, nor torments, nor distress, no matter how great these may be. On the contrary, these same torments will be refreshment to him, suffering for his God whom he loves so much." End quote. Now, that sweetness and refreshment that Francis and Tommaso identified proceeds from total reliance on God and depended on the friar's detachment from earthly, self-serving desires. So in what follows, we're going to examine this imperative in two distinct contexts. La próxima? The next slide? Perfect. The majority of surviving Capuchin bone installations are located on the island of Sicily. And these orchestrations of desiccated flesh undoubtedly encouraged friars to contemplate the transformative potential of death, just as they reinforced the Capuchin imperative to live in the spirit and put aside all carnal concern. As such, the Capuchin embellishments make an important contribution to the visual tradition of memento mori. Next slide. In Palermo, for example, the catacombs from the Centro della Pace are arranged much like a stratified city of the dead, Città dei Morti, where 4 corridors create a quadrilateral, traversed by a 5th pathway, and each populated by mummified cadavers, segregated by gender and social class. Now, within the context of Capuchin aesthetical training, one may be tempted to interpret the catacombs as an incarnated dance of death, or dance macabre. Next slide. For visualizations of the theme, typically present a continuous horizontal line of figures underscoring death's leveling of social hierarchies, which are represented by exponents of each profession. Now, the dance macabre is frequently represented on the walls of cemeteries and charnel houses. La próxima. Next slide. And there are even some examples that integrate the repurposed skulls of those interred, such as that at the Wolhusen ossuary in Switzerland. Next slide. Other examples visualize the deceased as animated cadavers, as in the interpretation by Peter van der Bosch, but the allegory's warning about earthly transience is only part of the entangled network of relations at Palermo. Next slide. In fact, the specially preserved remains, the clothes, and the cartoline of the figures, they testify to a resistance to succumb to the transience of life. The mummified bodies present a deliberate attempt to prolong the connection between personal identity and material substance by preserving the physiognomies of individuals, albeit with limited success. But that said, the desire to halt the body's decay was widespread among Christians throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period. But in Palermo, the reason for doing so also stems from the context of a miracle. La próxima. Next slide. In his memoirs, the provincial superior Gian Maria da Castelvetrano recorded that in 1599, the bodies of 45 friars were discovered during an excavation of the Capuchins' burial site, which at the time was located behind the high altar of the church. We are told that 40 of the bodies perfectly preserved the appearance they had in life, exhibiting fresh and flexible muscle tissue and emitting a sweet-smelling odor. For early modern Catholics, the corpus incorruptum was understood as a corporeal manifestation of holiness, and it became one of the necessary requirements for sanctification during the 16th century. This was a consequence of the widely held belief that the corpse offered an indication of how the soul fared in the afterlife. In other words, the cadaver's rate of putrefaction, or how quickly the body decomposed, served as an indicator of its iniquity or its wickedness. And the body that resisted decomposition became a sign of its soul's purity. For this reason, places where miraculous stasis had occurred became popular sites of emulation. In Palermo, the discovery of 40 uncorrupted bodies drew crowds from every corner of the city, and it's not surprising that construction of an additional room was underway by 1601, and the crypt quickly became the site of imitative practices, such as mummification. Now, such treatment, specifically natural mummification, was desirable because it approximated the deceased to the external features of the 40 uncorrupted friars, whose ongoing supernatural potency is attested in records of miraculous intervention in the 17th and 18th centuries. La próxima slide. Interment within the crypts of Santa Maria della Pace was a unique privilege because it offered proximity to the site of a local miracle and the bodies through which the divine had operated. Now, in this context, the practice of mummification can be seen as expressing much more than a desire to hold on to earthly attachments, or even as a lesson about the futility of such attachments, because here, mummification was also an attempt to imitate the appearance of the corpus incorruptum, and thereby extend the terrestrial sign of the soul's place in heaven to the entire community of the dead. The Capuchin crypts of Palermo provide an important example of the polysemous nature of bone installations. The meanings and the functions of these arrangements are multiple and often contradictory. For alongside the promise of mummification to prolong the emotional attachment of the living to the dead, lies the potential for it to signal the vanity of such nostalgia. As memento mori, the cadaver installations could play an essential role in the aesthetical training of local friars, encouraging them to annihilate self-concern as they followed in the footsteps of St. Francis. The rewards for doing so were clearly manifest in the miracle of the 40 uncorrupted friars, who provided indisputable validation for the spiritual mission of the Palermo Capuchins throughout the post-Tridentine period. La próxima slide. In Rome, the circumstances precipitating the creation of bone installations beneath the church of Santa Maria della Concezione were very, very different. Right? There were no miracles promoted at the site of the crypts, but here too, the friars' exposure to elaborate arrangements of fragmented and mummified cadavers was intended to yield spiritual and emotional benefits. La próxima slide. In 1631, the Capuchin community of Rome relocated to a newly built convent and church near Piazza Barberini, bringing with them the remains of their fraternal predecessors from their previous home at San Bonaventura near the Fontana di Trevi. According to the architect, Fra Michele da Bergamo, the quantity of human remains required 300 horse carts to transport. La próxima. The bones were deposited in the vaulted spaces beneath the side chapels of the church's right flank, and the community of the dead was joined by an altar in 1692, where Mass was celebrated twice every morning, suggesting that the friars interacted with their departed brothers every day. Now, today, the installation is comprised of 24 mummified cadavers, along with the skeletal remains of roughly 3,700 friars. La próxima slide. These are positioned along the walls and ceilings in variegated architectonic schema, including niches, archisolia, arches, tympana, piers, pediment and baldacchino, as well as scrolling vegetable patterns, rosettes, stars, hourglasses, generic coats of arms, the instruments of Christ's Passion, and a figural tableau, including angels and a personification of death holding a scythe and scales, falce bilancia. When exactly the aesthetic elaboration of bodies began is very difficult to determine, given the scarcity of written testimony, and because the convent was under the clausura. We do not know who created these monuments, and before the 19th century, admission to the crypt without papal approval was permitted only to members of the order. Notwithstanding, the most concrete evidence for dating the installations remains the surviving mummified cadavers who were in place by the 1720s. Their installation would have necessitated the prior construction of niches and arcosolia that they occupy, suggesting that the ornamentation began in the early Settecento, if not earlier. Now, despite obvious visual and contextual differences, modern scholars have treated the crypts in Rome in the same way as the crypts in Palermo. That is, that they function as little more than memento mori. Now, such an account is true as far as it goes. The next slide. The fragmentation of bodies into regularized patterns along the walls, it stresses the dissolution of singular identity and offers an ironic warning to avoid earthly attachments. The same admonition is repeated in the winged hourglasses that suggest time flies, and by the anonymous coats of arms that line the corridor, paradoxically signaling the worthlessness of hereditary class and social status. However, recourse to the theme of vanitas cannot alone justify the materiality of the installations, nor can their effect be rooted only in physical revulsion. We must be careful to avoid a modern, depersonalized attitude towards death, or the temptation to reduce the structures of the installations to socially conventional signs. But these decorations do not function like other works of art. The next slide. Take, for example, the two severed and mummified arms that create the symbol of the Franciscan order in the crypt of the leg and thigh bones. These arms do not just symbolize those of St. Francis and Christ. The remains of a real person substitute for Francis. A real person's arm substitutes for Christ's. As I mentioned earlier, human bones retain a latent vitality. Individually, they await resurrection, but collectively, they also reflect the historical actuality of the friars who assembled them and who would one day have their own bodies added to the collection. The friars, in other words, could see themselves in their creative products. Now, as the site was added to over the centuries, ongoing physical labor with bones could evoke a powerful sense of shared substance with the deceased. This perception of material connectedness or equivalence, in turn, could reinforce recognition of communal identity, which already was fostered in the daily lives of the friars by their collective emulation of St. Francis. Next slide. When viewed as a form of aesthetical training, the artistic handling of cadavers becomes a form of discipline, which could encourage the reorientation of self-concern towards self-transcending altruistic desire. Such benevolent love was manifest in the friendships between brothers. In narrating the lives of the early Capuchins, the aforementioned chronicler, Bernardino Cioli, described how they, quote, loved each other so tenderly that they would never have wanted to be separated from one another, and that during meals, many of them would weep continuously for the great joy or sweetness they felt in their hearts, seeing such charity and love and kindness of the brothers and simplicity, much like the simple poor taking what they need, end quote. Now, these fraternal bonds of love, they did not end in physical death, but were nurtured through daily interactions with the deceased in the crypts. Given the care to lovingly preserve and curate the bodies, the significance of their remains extended well beyond the ability of the corpse to horrify. But this observation complicates one of the assumptions that underlies the entire history of early modern macabre. Next slide. In his book titled L'Homme devant la mort, the famous historian Philippe Ariès claimed that the decomposing body that appeared in Renaissance macabre productions was a symbol of spiritual imperfection and a physical indication of personal failure. Therefore, the decaying body that appears on transitombs, like the one of Antonio Amati here, or in the legend of the three living and the three dead that you see in the center, that this was a sinful body, and its capacity to inspire repentance depended on physical revulsion. Next slide. However, within the crypts of Santa Maria della Concezione, the oppressive materiality of the cadavers laid alongside bonds of fraternal love, predicated on shared suffering and the spiritual refreshment it provided. Now here the deceased were not left to rot in disorganized piles. Instead, the ossified remains of the community's forebears were shaped into architecture, supporting the cadavers of younger generations. This architecture of bones, next slide. This architecture of bones literalizes St. Paul's consolation to the Ephesians when he wrote that in Christ, quote, you two are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit, end quote. Several mummified cadavers are positioned upright and posed with their hands clasped in attitudes of prayer, so that they continue to model the penitential behavior expected of the order's members, and they invite the living, by way of their example, to pray with them and to pray for them. This means that the voice granted to the dead was not simply one of shock and admonition, but also collective love, historical continuity, and corporate salvation. And I'm going to skip ahead. La próxima. And the next one, la próxima. Sí, ancora, la próxima. Anche, la próxima. Sì, la prossima. E la prossima. Bene, per concludere. It is commonplace to describe the power of the cadaver as rooted in paradox, in the strange conflict it provokes between reason and faith. A conflict that the early Capuchins were well aware of and made good advantage to enable manifold interactions. The tension that we noted at Palermo and at Rome between the desire for and the denial of the body's material continuity and individual recognition is not so much a problem as it was productive. Confrontations with cadavers, for example, could offer a pedagogy of death that fostered one's liberation from earthly attachments. But at the same time, the mummified friars could alleviate the pain of detachment by extending the bond of fraternal love and encouraging identification with previous generations of faithful Capuchins. These bone-encrusted mortuary installations provided Capuchin communities with a somatic means of engaging post-Tridentine assumptions about personal survival and disillusion. The ambiguities they invoke highlight the necessity of situating them within specific historical contexts and practices. Only then can the crypt installations be recognized for their contribution to the early Capuchins' spiritual mission. Grazie.